The higher the class, the smaller the ball. The lower the class, the bigger the ball. Unknown.
Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. This episode is going to be a mix of the Economics of Sports Ball and the Old Money series, where I discuss what sports are historically associated with what social class. And I'm going to be primarily basing it off of my cultural experiences and my following of sports in the United States. In different countries and different cultures, some sports are considered higher or lower class than others, and accessibility in some sports than others is a lot more affordable in different parts of the world. So what I'm saying for generally applies to the United States might not really apply to other countries. And there is also class mobility. There are different ways that people in different classes can play each of these sports. But I'm going to be going generally by what is the most common way However, my categorization is really going to be based more on what is the most commonly played in each class, or which sport is commonly associated with each class, even though there is variance here. And I'm going to start with sports associated with the working classes and lower classes and move our way up. So when it comes to the lowest to the lower classes, like the dependent classes, they barely have any resources to play any sort of sports. They often do not have the time to play sports due to need to work as much time as possible to survive, or have other health constraints and financial constraints that prevent them from participating in any sort of athletic competitions. And also the poorest in our society often do not have school-sponsored sports or access to leagues, and do not have access to the infrastructure and equipment needed to play in most sports. So I'm going to generally refer to the bottom of this hierarchy more as the working class sports. And the things really in common with working class sports is that they typically don't need very much space to play. They could be improvised in a variety of urban environments or undeveloped rural environments, which is where the working class is most commonly, in either more traditionally dense urban areas or in more lower density rural areas. The suburbs are more the domain of the middle class. However, that has been changing over time. And yeah, they often have low cost, those are affordable to play and don't require much. They have plenty of access, and oftentimes, at least at the youth level, the sports that are the most popular for the working classes are ones that can help you get out of the working classes. And the other kind of component for a lot of working class sports is they tend to be more violent or physically dangerous. And it's not really because the working class is inherently more violent. It's more because middle class, and upper class parents do not want their kids participating in sports that can be of physical danger to their children, because they have economic opportunities through the education system or the professional world that are more easily accessible and lower risk than competing in a sport like boxing, where you can get severe brain damage or even die. But if you're somebody from a working class background, the opportunity to use boxing to move up into the middle class and above is a lot more appealing due to lack of other options to do so, primarily education. So with that in mind, really the most common working class sports in America and really in a lot of the Western world include martial arts generally, because martial arts also has the boost of the self-defense benefit. There are upper class people who also do martial arts, but martial arts is more popular in the working class due to relative affordability, the self-defense bonus, and again, violence that a lot of parents do not want their children participating in as they move up in the competitive ranks. Boxing is definitely a working class sport. It used to be more of a middle and upper middle class sport in the 19th century and before, but over the years, especially as boxing has become less popular on TV and is more tied to pay-per-view, it's kind of lost its popularity among the middle classes and is increasingly become a more working class sport, especially after happened with Muhammad Ali and his notable battles with Parkinson's and concussions and a lot of the brain damage from the great boxers in the mid-20th century has scared a lot of middle and upper middle class people from participating in boxing. And then weightlifting is a common one. The only really thing you need to get involved in that to start is a gym membership. It's also a commonly working class sport for similar reasons for boxing. MMA is also a working class sport for similar reasons, except the difference is that wrestling doesn't have the same ability to utilize it for economic gain beyond the collegiate level. Whereas MMA and boxing have a lot of economic upside if you're successful. The other working class sports are bowling, basketball, and American football and soccer. And again, American football, soccer, and basketball are also popular middle class sports, but with American football in particularly, it is on the decline because of the concussion issues. And a lot, again, more highly educated parents, particularly in the Northeast and the West Coast, are less willing to put their children through the potential health and brain damage risks of playing American football. I mean, there's some parts like the South and the Midwest where those concerns are superseded by the cultural prestige of being involved in American football. But in general, I think the sport is moving down to a working class sport. Basketball is generally a working class sport because you can play it in a relatively small area. Half court takes well less than an acre of land. It can be played in urban areas as long as you have a hoop. It's often funded by local municipalities. You can play on the professional level. Basketball is getting increasingly more upper class due to the genetic destiny implied with the NBA. According to the Wall Street Journal, over 46% of NBA players have at least one parent who's a professional athlete or relative. And height is a genetically driven thing. And a lot of the other talents in basketball are more genetically driven. And if you have parents who are professional athletes, they have the resources to train you better. So if you really want to make it the highest levels in basketball, it's becoming a more upper class sport. But for more casual players and almost high school and college level, it still remains middle class to working class sport. Soccer is also in America is more of a middle class sport because it's a popular, accessible sport for young kids to play. But in terms of like the rest of the world, it's definitely a working class sport because it allows a lot of upward mobility for people from desperately poor countries and working class backgrounds within Europe to actually have a chance to move up when their other opportunities are limited. And also soccer, all you need is just an open field or even a patch of dirt and a ball. Like you don't even really need the goalpost. You can theoretically just draw a line in the sand or put two like cones or markers or something to indicate where the goal is. And so soccer is a classic working class sport where people can just move up through the ranks, just talent, no matter what their background is. And it's relatively affordable to play. So that kind of summarizes the working class sports. Now we're going to move up to the middle class sports. And middle class sports are things that do have some entry costs, usually some basic equipment, but not too much entry costs. Usually a lot of the infrastructure can be played at like a basic suburban park or at a common suburban gym or high school. And you can play locally enough that it doesn't require extensive traveling or capital equipment beyond just like the basic gear to play. Sports that will be included in this category really are like American football, which I mentioned before, archery, track and field, which I would argue track and field could also be a working class sport due to the low cost of entry. But a lot of families in the working class just don't have time to have their kids be competing at track meets and may not have like the quality of nutrition needed to last in certain endurance competitions. But I could say track and field, depending on the type of activity, can be a working class or a middle class sport. Like some of them might be upper or upper middle class, such as triathlons. Something I learned really the hard way is how class determined certain basic activities that I took for granted that everybody did. An example of this would be like swimming. I've been an avid swimmer. I competed on a swim team for 9 years. In fact, I've played sports on every class level, even working class sports. I was competitive in bowling and I did boxing like on a training level, but I never competed in matches for the reasons mentioned before, why a lot of parents don't want their kids in working class sports, mainly prevent brain damage. But swimming is probably the most middle-class sport that I did. And when I went to college and I met people from more working class backgrounds or cultures that just didn't prioritize swimming or more inland areas of the country, I was surprised how a sizable minority of my peers didn't know how to swim or had never competed in any sort of swim meet. And that was baffling. Like, swimming is a marker generally for class in the West. Like in some other parts of the world where swimming is just not in the culture, this doesn't apply. But in most Western countries, like knowing how to swim or not how to swim is a class marker. And competing in swim teams is also like a sign you're middle class and above at some point. So that is one. Skiing is a middle class, but it's increasingly becoming an upper middle class sport because of the increased cost of lift tickets in America. In Europe, it's still a middle class sport, as skiing is relatively more affordable there than in the United States. Other middle class sports like badminton, baseball, where baseball can be expensive due to equipment, but that makes it a little bit too pricey for a working class. Like, there's a lot of issues with this that initiatives such as the RBI, Reviving Baseball in Inner Cities, have tried to deal with. But baseballs with bats and balls and gloves and cleats and other specialized equipment, and also the infrastructure for baseball being a little bit more complicated than football or basketball, makes it more of a middle class sport compared to the other working class sports. Handball, whether like team handball, the Olympic style in Europe or in America, like I guess they call it wall ball in other sort of parts of the country, the big rubber ball and hit it against the wall. Foursquare, a lot of these playground games are kind of middle class sports. Softball, middle class sport. Table tennis is a middle class sport just because of the cost of having to buy a ping pong table. And gymnastics studios are common in middle class suburbs, but there is kind of an entry cost to having a membership to such things. So those are kind of the middle class sports. The other one, which is kind of on the line between middle and upper middle class, is racquetball. Racquetball is a lot more accessible than squash, but it's still not that common in suburbs, particularly since the 1990s when a lot of racquetball courts were torn out for other uses over time. It was back then, it was more of a middle class sport, but it's kind of faded in recent decades. And now we're going to move up to the upper class and upper middle class sports. Upper middle class sports often have more costs of entry and often require traveling, and they're just not really heard of. Like, they're not in popular culture. You kind of have to go out and find them, and they're more in niche communities. I'd say upper middle class sports include skiing and snowboarding, which I've mentioned before. Figure skating, like in theory, like skating is a relatively low cost sport, but you still need to buy skates and you still need to be able to go to a rink on a regular basis and have time for your parents to drive you to the rink, because you're not going to find ice skating rinks on high school campuses. I mean, there are some places where you could lake skate, like in the north of the country, in like Minnesota, Michigan, the Northeast, Canada. And I think hockey and skating are more middle class sports in colder parts of the country, but in warmer parts of the country, hockey and ice skating and winter sports in general are definitely more upper middle class sports due to increased cost, whether travel or just accessibility. I would say other sports really in this category would be like triathlon, because the level of, if you're strong enough of a swimmer to do triathlon, it's often associated with being more upper middle class. I think surfing has increasingly become more of a upper middle class sport. I mean, especially because a lot of the beaches where people will go surfing are now in more upper middle class neighborhoods. But it's still, I mean, surfboards are considerably more expensive than other sporting equipment, and it is kind of a niche sport. Water polo as well. Like, the only reason I knew water polo existed is because in my high school growing up, there was a prominent water polo team. In fact, the water polo team was kind of ranked on the top of the social hierarchy like a football team is in most middle American high schools. They were the big men on campus. And if I didn't go to this school, I would have never heard of water polo. And by the time I even knew what it was, I was too old to start playing it. And that's kind of a common thing. Tennis is just my favorite sport to play, is a stereotypically upper middle class sport. I think tennis is actually a sport that's becoming more accessible and moving down in the middle class, because a lot of suburbs in the United States do build public tennis courts. and there are more acts, and tennis isn't that expensive. You can buy a racket, a very high quality one for under $300 and you could buy one that's workable for under $100. Tennis balls aren't that expensive either. It's like $3 a pack. And tennis courts are mainly available for free, or there are low cost tennis clubs in places where they're not available for free. And the impact of people such as the Williams sisters playing in tennis has also made it perceived to be a more accessible sport. So tennis is actually one of those sports that's moving down in terms of class. It's historically been an upper class sport, but increased accessibility is allowing more middle class people to play. So those are what I would consider like the upper middle class sports. So like skiing, tennis, more advanced swimming, water polo, and cycling is the other one I forgot to mention. Bikes in theory are not that expensive, but the bikes that you need to get to like compete, whether indoor track cycling or long distance urban cycling races or mountain biking, do get more pricey. And again, you also need intense level of training and nutrition to do this properly. And cycling has actually replaced golf for a lot of the upper middle class because it generates more exercise and you can do it in more different places. And then that's the other sport I'm going to mention too, is a shifted from an upper class sport to an upper middle class sport, is golf. Golf used to be restricted just to a few high-end country clubs that required increased buy-ins, but the development of municipal courts and privately held public courses, which are ones you can just pay green fees for a day to play a round of 18, has made golf a lot more accessible. Golf's probably my second favorite sport to play. And if it was restricted to country clubs, I would have maybe played a handful of times my entire life. But the accessibility of public golf courses expanded golf to the upper middle class. And even a lot of the middle class plays golf now. But golf has also, the reason why I wouldn't really call it truly a middle class or working class sport is because there is high barriers to entry for equipment costs and green fees. Like green fees at a decent golf course range anywhere from 75 USD to 300 USD for 18 holes. Like a set of golf clubs is probably going to cost you about like $750 to $1,200 to the irons, and then another $100 to $300 each for each of your woods, and then a putter. And you got to buy golf balls. And if you're not a super good golfer, you're probably going to lose at least 2 or 3 golf balls every round. And that adds up over time. So, and then you have to spend often a whole day taking it off work or going away from your friends and family to play golf for a whole day, which even if it's not an economic cost, it's a time cost that a lot of the middle class just simply does not have. So that's why I consider golf to still be an upper middle class sport. And then let's go like to the old money and new money sports, like the really upper class sports that you don't really see very commonly played by the middle classes. And then for the old money, it's stuff that there's like long forms of tradition that goes back often for centuries. Like this is what the nobility played in the UK and France for years. And tennis used to be one of these sports before it became more accessible. And it's usually restricted to private clubs or require very expensive equipment or very extensive plots of land that make membership to those clubs prohibitively expensive, because the highest and best use of that land otherwise, like whether it's for housing or commercial developments, require the price of this thing to be high enough for it to make sense to exist. So the old money traditional sports really include, first of all, anything involving horses, whether it's equestrian, whether it's horse racing, whether it's playing polo. It's just in the modern era, really since the automobile became mainstream, like the cost of maintaining horses has just made any sport involved with a horse prohibitively expensive, because the only reason you'd own a horse now is for leisure or to compete in these sports. And some of these sports like polo require 4 to 6 horses to play a single match because the horses get tired and you have to switch them out. So yeah, that's why polo is known as the sports of kings, because it's prohibitively expensive. I mean, the only reason I've ever had a chance to play it because I went down and did it in Argentina, where it was a lot more affordable to do it than it would be in North America to play polo. Yeah, even the upper middle class are just priced out simply because you need to own a certain amount of horses. You need membership to a polo club. The equipment gets costly too. So that's kind of the oldest of the old money exclusive sports. And then other things, equestrians sports are very expensive. Like, it's not a reason to stereotype of the rich man's daughter being an equestrian, because it requires a lot of money to be involved in that sport. The other things that are old money sports really include, there is some new money, like Larry Ellison's got really involved with the America's Cup, for example, but sailing has historically been a very old money sport. There are some upper middle class people who've gotten involved with it because their local municipality offers like sailing school for kids or like sailing classes for the community to get involved in. And sailing is fun, but it's very inaccessible. Most of the time you need to own a sailboat or be part of a yacht club that you can rent a sailboat, or live in a coastal area, whether near the ocean or near a big enough lake. And that real estate is often more expensive. So it's very prohibitively expensive to be in sailing. And it's been a traditional activity since people started sailing boats in antiquity. And so it's got the combination of the tradition and the cost prohibitiveness to be a really old money sport. Private clubs would be this category. Squash, which is kind of like racquetball, but with a smaller ball that's really hard to bounce. I personally prefer playing racquetball because it's just more fun. The ball bounces high enough that like you don't have to like, it's easier to keep a rally going than in squash. I've always found squash just unenjoyable because it's just a more difficult version of racquetball, but it's considered very elite and tied to private clubs. Like a lot of elite clubs will, when you say, oh, why won't you play racquetball instead of squash? They'll laugh at you and think like racquetball is just a 90s middle class fad. But the court access is prohibitively expensive and it has a patrician era. The one that's surprisingly the old money that is actually more accessible than perceived is rowing. Rowing was kind of one of the first sports competed at the collegiate level, and a lot of the old money Ivy Leagues kind of built their back on rowing. But at the same time, like rowing does have prohibitively expensive equipment with the boats, but it's an 8-man team and there's a lot of like rowing clubs that you can join, whether on the high school level or the college level, that you don't require you to own it. You can either rent the equipment or often even use it just for free as part of competing on the team or just as part of your membership to the rowing club. And rowing, even though it has a lot of old money prestige, it actually is very accessible to people of anybody middle class and above. And so I'm surprised it's often classed as, but it's still historically an old money sport. And the equipment costs and the need for a boat club. And it becomes especially hard to participate in it once you're graduated from college. And those are kind of, I'd say, the most old money sports. New money sports are sports that are simply just expensive, but don't really have like the tradition or class signifying exclusivity. The most common like new money sports often are like extreme sports. I mentioned surfing, but that's, I think, more of an upper middle class sport. But things like hang gliding, like BMX, like on the high level, anything you'd find in the X Games, really, basically, except for maybe snowboarding and surfing, in like base jumping, like this stuff that's relatively new. Like these sports have most likely been invented within the last 50 years, but they're very expensive. They're very risky, like the equipment or the places you have to go to actually do them. And so it kind of restricts the crowd to new money. So that's why extreme sports really tend to be new money activities. Same with like gliding planes. Motorsports in general are new money because there really are no barriers to entry on a class basis in terms of like social or anything to get involved with them. And they're fairly new. Like the automobile was only invented in the late 1880s. And so things like Formula One, IndyCar, NASCAR, like if you're not from money, you're not going to be able to compete at that. Like even if you're upper middle class, your parents probably do not have enough money for you to be buying high-end go-karts and going to all of these races as a kid, and then being able to buy all the motor equipment to race on the higher levels when you are a young adult or a teenager. So like motorsports are probably the most new money stereotypically of sports. Mountain climbing is another one. And like a golf where the membership is simply a buy-in. And yeah, even some like sailing. But generally, I think the most new money sport is motorsports. So overall, this kind of wraps up like the associations where you have with sports. The smaller the ball, the higher the class generally applies, but really ball sports start to decline in popularity really once you get to the upper middle classes. There's one sport that I'd like to ask you about, and it's one that I actually competed in at the collegiate level, but is kind of not sure where to put it, and that's fencing. Like fencing has a lot of old money prestige. Like the only Division One like fencing programs are like Ivy League and old timey Northeastern schools. And I definitely did not compete at that level, but they have fencing clubs at universities all across the country. There are places that you can fence in most metropolitan areas. And there is some equipment cost. Like you gotta have but oftentimes that comes with the club membership, whether that's the outfits, the fencing masks, the strip, the electronics needed to hook up to your fencing outfit, so that like the blade can score properly when you're made contact, and then the blades themselves, the foils, the epées, and the saber. Like if I had to buy all that stuff on my own, it probably would be prohibitively expensive, and that's probably why you don't see middle class and upper middle class people competing in fencing in middle school or high school. So I didn't pick up a blade until my freshman year of college, and because it's something I wanted to try, more of a hobby than like as like a serious competitive sport to help me get a college scholarship. And fencing is also one of the most popular sports that a lot of elites use to help them with admissions to Ivy League, because again, like at the lower levels in terms of age, it becomes more cost prohibitive. But again, there are fencing clubs in a lot of urban areas now. It's become more popular. And there's also historically European martial arts, which is like a more medieval version of like fencing and sword play that is also becoming more popular. So there, in theory, like if you do it through a club, it can be as accessible to even the middle classes. But on the other hand, if you don't have access to a club and you need to buy all the equipment yourself, it becomes prohibitively expensive for anybody other than the old money. And the branding is associated more with the old money than new money. But yeah, where would you put fencing? Please leave that in the comments, because I'm not really sure on the answer to that. And is there any other sport that I missed that I should have really included on here? And what sports do you think are old money or new money? And if you're a non-American watching this, what sport would you think is considered more high class in your country or low class in your country compared to the United States? I appreciate making this a broader conversation, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share if you like this type of content.